Hello, welcome to our Tailgate Talk session number 2. I think today's session applies to any livestock owner, whether you're running horses, cattle, llamas, pigs, sheep, whatever. We use electrified fence to keep animals out of spaces like hay piles or ponds, or to keep them in spaces like your pasture, or as a perimeter fence, or as a rotational grazing system. We all use electric fence. So today, District Livestock Agent Rod Schaub from the Frontier District, which is Franklin and Ottawa counties, is going to share with you a series of videos about electric fence, all the gadgets, and what you can do to make your electric fence better. Rod not only is the livestock agent, but he also uses quite a bit of the fencing on his own farm. So enjoy Rod's presentation.
Hello, I'm Rod Schaub. I work for Frontier Extension District, and today we're going to do a series of short videos that deal with electric fence. The first video that we're going to do is one on why do we want to try electric fence, or will electric fence work for me at my ranch? And you know, for years and years and years, we've went through and we've used barbed wire, we've used woven wire fence. When we get closer to the corral, we use pipe, or maybe we use plank fencing. Those types of fences are all physical barrier fences. In other words, the cow can't jump over it, can't go through it, or can't crawl under it. So it's a physical barrier. It's there to stop that cow from moving to the next pasture. Today, what we want to talk a little bit about is electric fence. An electric fence is a psychological barrier. You want that cow, when she touches it the very first time, you want her to know that she is to be staying inside of that. You want it to water her eyes and buckle her knees, and then you know that that cow will learn. Recently, I was reading a book that Temple Grandin wrote, and it talked about how this cow wouldn't go into the squeeze chute. She'd go up the alley, but she wouldn't enter the squeeze chute. Well, even with a prod, she would go into the squeeze chute, but then she wouldn't put her head in the neck in the neck catch, regardless of how many times you give her electric shock. And she had learned that when she puts her neck in that squeeze, that head catch, that it's going to cause pain. And so they can understand pain, they can remember. And so this electric fence, we want them to remember that it's hot and that they aren't to touch it. And really, you know, when we talk about electric fence, when we talk about any fence, any good fence is a fence that keeps the livestock where we want those cattle to stay at. So since we're talking about electric fence, there's two types of electric fence. There's permanent electric fence and there's temporary electric fence. Most of the permanent fence is done with 12.5 gauge high tensile wire. It's class 3 galvanized, so it lasts for a really long time. We've all put up barbed wire, and after 15 or 20 years it starts to rust. Well, with the high tensile wire, it's got that class 3 galvanized on it, and it is going to last for a long time, maybe 50 years before it starts to rust. It's also very easy to put up and some of those kinds of things. The other thing that you can use for permanent fence would be aircraft cable, and that is used quite often too, and it's easier to take down if you needed to take down a permanent fence. The temporary fence is often done with polywire, and the polywire actually has different metals woven into that, and that is what provides the shock. It's very easy to take up and put down. I have a farm about 3/4 of a mile from here. We'll put up fake temporary electric fence all the way over, and we can run the cows up and down the road, and they don't push the fence because they know that it could be hot, even though in this instance it isn't. So it comes back to, you know, there's pros and cons about using electric fence. And I can remember As a kid growing up, we did everything wrong. We used 17.5 gauge wire. We used rebar for ground rods. We didn't use any clamps. We'd just take the copper wire and wrap around the ground rod. When the grass got tall, you know, it would short out the fence. We all had really, really bad experiences at that time. And I think we don't understand the changes that have been made, and we're not as familiar with electric fence as we maybe should be. Some of the pros is it's really less expensive. If you were going to build a mile of 5-wire barbed wire, it costs you somewhere around $10,000. If you build a single wire permanent electric fence, it's going to be just a fraction of that. A 4,000-foot roll of high tensile wire is going to cost somewhere around $85 to $100. Another thing is you're also going to put a post in every 60 feet rather than every 16 feet. So it's going to be more least expensive. It's going to be durable. It's going to last a long time. It's fairly easy to install because you don't have all the posts that you have to put in. And it's also the most flexible, especially if you're talking about temporary fence. So I hope today I've intrigued you a little bit to look into electric fence, and I'm going to follow this up with a whole series of electric fence issues like the charger, the ground rods, the lightning protection, the fence, those kinds of things. So until next time, this is Rod Schaub. Thank you. Well, welcome back. I'm Rod Schaub. I work for Frontier Extension District, and this is the second in a set of videos on electric fencing. Today we're going to talk about the charger or the energizer. You know, there's lots and lots of different companies out there that sell chargers. But what I want you to do is I want you to kind of find the one that fits for you. I want you to find a low impedance charger. We also want one that's going to have a minimum of 5,000 volt output anytime you have a load on the fence itself, okay? Another thing about the charger, you want it to have 35 to 65 pulses per minute, and we want to make sure that it has snap-in modules. You know, if you spend $300, $400, $500, maybe $1,000 on a charger, we sure don't want it when it breaks down that we can't repair it. So we want one that has snap-in modules, okay? And chargers come, you can buy 110 chargers, you can buy battery chargers, or you can buy solar chargers. I would prefer to use a 110 charger all the time. My main reason for doing that is I feel like electricity is more reliable maybe than a battery or solar power. So if you do have to use a solar powered charger, if you're using one of the chargers that have those small panels on them, try not to make that your on a permanent fence. They're not typically high enough output that they will handle a lot of fence, okay? If you're going to have to use a solar powered panel, I would prefer to use one of those big ones like we use on watering systems, you know, that are you know, 3 foot tall or something like that. Those are going to be the ones that are going to be able to make enough energy to store in that battery to run then the charger. When you size a charger, there's lots of different ways. You know, you can the advertisement says here's how many miles they'll do. One will say here's how many acres there is. Here's one that'll say this is how many stored joules or output joules that the charger has. When you're looking at that, I really have a hard time with miles because we don't know whether that's 1 wire, 2 wires, how many wires are going to run for that many miles. If we're looking at acres, you know, a square acreage always has smaller sides than a rectangular. So if you had something that was like 4 acres by 4 acres, when you add those 4 sides up, you have 16. If you have something that's 2 by 8, all of a sudden now you have 20. So I don't really like the acres thing, and I really prefer to use joules. And joules is what that actually is. A joule is a measurement of the horsepower that pushes the pulse through the electric fence. And what we've kind of come to find out, under an average load, we need about 1 joule per mile of output per mile of fence, okay? And so when you're buying a charger, always buy a charger that's bigger than what you think you're gonna need or what you need currently. Always buy a bigger one. And the reason is maybe you have your paddocks already set up and you know how many miles of fence you have built. But what happens if we start strip grazing and we start putting more fence out there? Maybe we decide we're gonna break the paddocks into 2. You might as well have that charger that's just a little bit bigger and will then fit into the new system as well. Also, when we're talking about chargers, we want to make sure that if we have a 110 charger, that we put surge protection on the end where we plug it into 110, and we also want to have lightning protection on the ground side. And we'll talk more about the lightning protection in a couple of videos. Next time when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about ground systems and how to set up a ground system. See you next time. Hello, I'm Rod Schaub, and I work for Frontier Extension District. And welcome back. This is the 3rd in the series of our electric fence videos. Today we're going to talk about the ground system. And you know, last time we talked about how the charger was the heart of the system. The ground system is the whole rest of the body, because if something's going to go wrong, it's probably going to go wrong in the ground system. I've had phone calls and guys saying, well, my electric fence system doesn't seem like it's hot. What's going on? And so one of the things I'll do is I'll ask them, how many ground rods do you have in? And I would guess 90% of the time, or 95% of the time, they'll tell me 1 ground rod. Well, in eastern Kansas, we get dry. And there are times of the year when 1 ground rod's not going to be adequate. You know, for the ground system to work, or the whole charging system to work, when that cow touches that electric fence, that energy goes through her body, through her feet, back through the ground, back to the ground system, and that's when it completes its cycle and that cow gets a shock, okay? But if we're really, really dry, not enough of that electricity oftentimes gets back to the ground system, and so we don't have a good performing electric fence system. So it's kind of a rule of thumb that you start with a minimum of 3 6-foot ground rods into the ground. Okay, so we want 3 6-foot rods all the way into the ground. Now, that's just kind of the place where we start. We typically want 3 foot of a ground rod per joule of output from our charger. So if you remember last time we talked about our chargers and the joules, 1 joule would power 1 mile of fence. Well, now what we're looking at is we're taking those same joules and we're saying we need 3 foot of ground rod to give that ground system enough ground rods to perform adequately. So if you look at this charger right here says it's a 24 joule output charger. So 24 times 3 is 72. If you're going to do 6-foot ground rods, that means you need 12. How many of you would have ever guessed that any ground system would need 12 ground rods? My guess is nobody out there thinks about having that many ground rods. Now, we want to also talk about ground rods. when you go out to purchase ground rods, we have 5/8 inch diameter ground rods and we have 1/2 inch ground rods. I would always suggest that we use 5/8 inch. It's just that big, much bigger in diameter. It's just that much more soil in contact with that ground rod, and it will actually, there's not enough difference in cost to warrant going to a 1/2 inch ground rod, okay? Now, we've talked about, in this case, we needed 12. We need to space those about 10 foot apart, okay? And preferably in a moist area. So if it's in a drip line of a building, or let's say maybe we don't have that as an option, so we go out and we put it right underneath the fence. That may be the next best option we can do, is put it right underneath the fence. That way we can get our whole 120 feet that we need for that ground system. Now, you can use copper or you can use galvanized, okay? But don't mix the metals. Anytime you would mix metal, you're gonna get corrosion. And when you get corrosion, then you'll also get poor conductivity of that electricity. So we definitely want to, if we're gonna use copper, we wanna use copper wire, copper rods, as well as copper clamps. If we're going to use galvanized wire, galvanized clamps, and galvanized rods. Now here I am, I'm kind of a penny pincher, so I like to use the galvanized. Galvanized is much cheaper. You know, copper wire is expensive. A copper ground rod is probably 3 times what a galvanized ground rod is. So from that standpoint, I like to use the galvanized. The other thing we want to think about is when we're placing our ground system in the ground, we got to keep them at least 65 feet away from any other ground field. So if you have a utility ground or a well casing, or you have another building here that has a ground system, we need to keep this about 65 feet from those other areas. And then lastly, when we put these in the ground, we want to leave about this much out of the ground, okay? We want the clamp and the wire and 4 or 5 inches out of the ground so we can find that ground system if something happens. One more thing, when you run your wire and you go from your charger, you're going out to your ground system. And so if this is coming out, we don't want to break the wire at each clamp. We want to run the wire through it and out and over to the next one, okay? We don't want to break it because that's just one more opportunity then for us to have problems with our grounding system. Next time we're going to talk a little bit more about the lightning protection ground system that we're going to use for our charger. This is the 4th episode in the electric fence video series. Hi, I'm Rod Schaub, and the topic for this video is lightning protection for the charger. You know, when we talked about chargers, we talked about having a surge protector on the 110 side of the charger. We want that for any electric charger. We definitely want to protect it from lightning strikes that would come in from the 110 side. Today what we're really talking about is how can we protect it from lightning if it strikes out on the fence. So if it strikes out on the fence, we don't want that lightning, that energy to come back through here and blow our charger off the wall. So one of the things that's really critical is we have to have a separate ground system to catch that lightning energy rather than let it come back and seek out our ground system that we have, which is going to make it go through the charger and ruin our charger. So it's really critical that when we have our own ground system for our lightning protection, it has to be at least 65 feet from the charger ground field, okay? So we have to have it 65 foot away, and then we have one more thing. We have to have at least one more ground rod here, one more 6-foot ground rod here than we have over there. Because the idea is we want to attract the lightning to this ground field. We want it to come here. We don't want it to go that way. So when the lightning hits out here, it comes here, it goes down through this lightning arrestor and into the ground. That's what we're after. To get that accomplished, we have a couple of items here that you can see. Here's the lightning coil. This coil is made of underground wire, double insulated underground wire. It's been rolled, it's about 1 foot across, and there's 10 to 12 wraps. When I get that completely wrapped up like that, then I put zip ties on it, and that's what my coil is going to look like. What the lightning coil does is, if electricity from the lightning strike goes down through here, but there's some leftover current, maybe it's going to go towards the charger. The idea behind the lightning coil is that energy will wrap around there and spin around there several times and then reverse itself and put the energy back out on the fence. And that's kind of where we want it. If it doesn't go into the ground system, we don't want it to go through our charger. Then, and notice, this is on the hot wire that goes out to the fence. So then once we get just past the coil, then we want to put a lightning arrestor on. And this is a homemade lightning arrestor, and the idea here is to get that to jump that electricity from the lightning to jump this little distance and go into the ground system. One of the ways we set this is we want to make sure that this is at least 1/4 of an inch to start with. And these can be loosened up and adjusted as needed. So you'll turn your charger on, and you will raise or lower that until it quits snapping. Once it quits snapping, once there's no electricity going into the ground system, you have it set just about perfect. Because remember, we might be putting 10,000 volts out this way onto the fence, but that lightning bolt is going to be a whole lot more than 10,000 volts. And when it comes back in, we want it to seek the ground, and the best ground system that we have will be this one, and there's no doubt as many volts as it has, it'll jump this little 1/4 inch gap and go into the ground. So those are some of the things. Now you can purchase lightning coils. You can purchase the lightning arrestors. Matter of fact, here's a lightning arrestor, and it would take this place just like this. You would have this wire would hook to the top, the ground wire would hook to the bottom, and when lightning would strike the fence, it would come down through here. If you look in the back of this, it will burn these out, but it will let the electricity go into the ground. These will melt. And so the reason I don't like this is, if it's mounted up on a fence, you'll never know whether it's been hit or not unless you take it off after every storm and look, you know. This way I can see this, I know that the gap's there, I know that it's set. There's another system that you can buy, and this actually has the lightning coil, it has the lightning arrestor, and we can show you how this would go. We'd actually not have this coil on here. This lead out wire that goes to the fence would hook here. The wire from the fence would hook here, and then if you can see this, we can adjust this by however much we need to set our gap. Then what happens is, when the lightning hits, it comes back to this, it jumps this gap, follows this around, hooks onto our ground system, and goes down into the ground. So this is the whole unit that can be purchased this way. I just prefer to build my own. If you do build these, make sure that this is non-conductive, and it'll work just fine. A lot of the information that I'm presenting is actually from the Missouri Electric Fencing for Serious Grazers Manual. And if you would look in this book, you would see that on page 11, here are some diagrams that they've drawn up for lightning chokes. If you look on page 19, here are some home-built lightning arresters. Now, to find this book, just Google the title, Missouri Electric Fencing for Serious Grazers. It's a really good resource. I think you'll find it very handy. And until next time, Rod Schaub.
Well, I hope you found those videos helpful. One of the resources you might have seen on the desk was this Missouri Electric Fencing book that's put out by the Missouri NRCS, and we'll provide a link so you can download that and get one of your own. Rod has several other videos posted, and we'll also send you that link. We would like to invite you to a third session on the week of July 20th on brush and weed control. That'll be by David Hallauer, our district crops and horticulture specialist. And then we are still hopeful that the week of August 18th that we can be in the field for our last session on water systems. And so we will be making that decision a few weeks before the event. Thanks for participating.